All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for Atomic Storytelling. If you folks want to learn how story can change you, can change your organization, or even change the world, you've come to the right place. Hello, my name is Sienna Jackson. I'm a two-time founder, CEO, and producer from Los Angeles, California. I've worked on numerous film and TV projects you may have seen, and the work I currently do in social impact and philanthropy has directly touched the lives of over 250,000 people. I'm really happy to be here today, and I'm joined by my friend and collaborator, Chris Hare. Chris, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely, thanks, Sienna. So my name's Chris. I'm the founder of The Storied Future, created Atomic Storytelling, and my focus is really on helping leaders transform their companies through storytelling, but also transform themselves. And that's a big part of what we're going to be focusing on today. So the Atomic Storytelling method, I've used it to great effect, but I actually started out using it to not great effect. I built a brand campaign for Amazon once that was shot down by Jeff Bezos twice because it lacked an atomic story. Also at Amazon, used an atomic story to unleash $68 million in incremental revenue on a single landing page. Shifted the future of a waste-to-energy startup. Transformed a national paint distributor that was being disrupted by big e-commerce. And then also, a big part of my work is helping midlife leaders unlock what's next through telling their stories. So, as you'll be able to see, stories can really be used to transform individuals and companies of all shapes and sizes.
Okay, so what are we learning today, and kind of how are we taking this knowledge and experience you have and kind of encapsulating it into things that people need to know?
Yeah, so we're going to give examples and workshop some things, but the big goal for today is for you to kind of feel and believe in atomic storytelling, and that it's something that can work for you. So that's the first piece, and then want people to think more deeply about the future that they're trying to create, and then lastly, understand how their atomic stories can fuel their journey to that future.
Gotcha.
So I think to jump right in, we're going to do a little exercise here. This is one that I don't do with companies, but I do with leaders. So hopefully this doesn't put people to sleep this early in the morning. But I'm going to have everyone close their eyes. I want you to fast forward to 2054, your first day of retirement or exiting your company. You no longer have a title, no longer have a paycheck, no more email, no more power. You got the plaque yesterday, the pat on the back, the watch. And you're at a movie theater, and you're here to just relax. You bought a ticket for the latest blockbuster, and you got your popcorn in your hand, your Coke in your hand, and the movie starts playing. But instead of the movie that you think you bought a ticket for, it's actually a movie of your life. So we're going to pause for about a minute, and I want you to think through scene after scene that plays through your mind across your life and across your career. And I want you to think about, the things that you're proud of, things that you're not so proud of or ashamed of. Think about the people that you brought with you and perhaps the people you left behind as well. So we're going to pause and just sit for a moment and let you process that. Now, Sienna, so obviously when I do this with a leader, it's a much longer exercise, but so hopefully you got just a little taste of it. But I'm curious for you, Sienna, what were some of the things with that movie that started to play for you that came to you?
Yeah, so for me, 2054, I'd be 61 because I'm 31 now. And so when I think about being halfway towards that journey and then skipping ahead, I actually see myself not being an entrepreneur anymore. I honestly see myself being a full-time philanthropist and a science fiction writer. I actually have a lot of manuscripts just like hidden around on a hard drive somewhere that are like mostly finished. So I imagine myself traveling the world, learning a bunch of languages, and just publishing my science fiction.
I love it. And I think when, and I can share, I'm sorry if I forgot if I mentioned this or not, but if you hit me up on the QR code through LinkedIn, I'm happy to share instructions on how to really walk through all of this and kind of deep dive on it. But one of the things I notice is people often, when they're thinking about the things they have accomplished, it's focused very positive, which is great. But I think it's also good as you go through and work it yourself, thinking about also what are some of the downs as well. So yeah, I love that future for you.
Thank you.
So,
Oh, you know what? Actually, that was a really cool exercise, but I think on the screen, why do we tell stories in general? Like not just visualization exercises, but what is the value in telling stories about not just your future, but also your past and your present?
yeah, so part of why, not just because my company's called The Storied Future, but why I start with that future piece is anchoring in and really getting a vision of where you want to head, whether it's you individually or your company. But that's a moment in time, right? And there's an arc to get there. And so, as we'll talk about, the atomic stories are really the fuel that gets you to that destination, right?
Just taking a step.
Exactly. And then if the arc that you're traveling to get there isn't working, then it's how do you fuel that with additional news stories? So in terms of why we tell stories, it's really for three reasons. The first is to get, the second is to build, and then the third is to become, really kind of mapping to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So get is really get in the room, get the deal, get paid, get people to follow you because of who you are, right? Those kinds of things. And there's nothing wrong with that level, right? We all have to pay the bills, right? The second piece is build, and so it could be building a differentiated executive brand, building a following that gets your vision, building a company that really stands the test of time. And so that's the second one. And then the third one is really become, right? The self-actualization piece of becoming the leader that you want to become, becoming more aligned to your core values, and becoming more deeply connected with your purpose and how you manifest that in the world.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and I get kind of the theory now, but do you have like a tangible example of you applying this in kind of your own life and career?
Absolutely. So you're going to learn a little bit about Chris right now. So rewind, I think it was about 2001. I'd lost my job, had nowhere to live, broke up with the girl I thought I was going to marry, and had no money, but was trying to get up to Seattle. So there was this company that was selling, my buddy was selling self-coiling garden hoses for this company at a flower and garden show. So he said, hey, if you want to come out and sell with us, we can front you $500 to move to Seattle.
Oh my God.
And that's how we'll get you up here. So they did that. I moved up. We go to this flower and garden show. But here's the thing. My narrative, my belief, and my identity was I'm not a salesman and I hate selling. In fact, that's in my mind, it was like kind of the lowest of the low, right? But I had to do it to survive. So show up at this flower and garden show. It was beautiful. It was like the Chelsea Flower and Garden Show. There were like life-size hobbit houses and all of this. We get to our tent, and literally all they had was a pallet of boxes with a green sheet tossed over it, no sign, no marketing materials, right? And I thought, okay, this is going to be a long five days, right? Our very first customer shows up, and I'm trying to get up the gumption to be able to sell, just kind of sitting down and hunkering down, right? Our very first customer comes up, and she's returning her product from the previous year.
Oh.
So the only thing worse for me than selling is selling something I don't believe in.
Yeah.
So, but as time went on, I thought, I can kind of sit here and kind of just wallow in this, or I can just kind of get out there and experiment. So I get outside the tent, and thankfully we'd been put in the #1 traffic spot in the whole park. But the crowd started to build, and the crowd started to build, so I just start my pitch. I start saying it over and over and over again. And then I start getting louder and louder and louder as the crowd builds and getting more and more and more confident. And before you know it, I'm yelling like a street corner preacher. And I'm reeling people in. And what was crazy and crazy scary was I got so good so fast because of the number of reps that I still remember there was a couple walking along, and the wife started to turn and look, and the husband did not want to come in. And I changed my pitch midair and it was just like snap their heads around and reeled them in, and then my buddy closed them. So we ended up doubling the company sales record. We sold out in 2 days of the 5 days. We didn't have flyers, so we went and made a bunch at Kinko's. We didn't know that the phone number we put on there was the president of the company's desk, and it dialed him directly for weeks after that. So we probably sold about $250,000 in product. Back then, I sucked at negotiating, so I think I got paid about $1,500 total. So lots of growth has happened since then. But so that was the piece, right? Is I went from I hate sales in that short period of time to I'm a salesman, right? It shifted my identity and that transformation. And so what I love, the reason I share this story is really my old narrative was I hate selling, and the old identity is I'm not a salesman. The Atomic story is that energy and matter that shifted things for me, right? And then that created this new narrative on my journey, which is I'm a salesman.
Yeah. So the story is a tool that can shift your narrative and therefore reframe your whole perspective.
100%.
I have a personal story that makes me think of that I think we'll get to later.
Awesome. Yeah. So in terms of defining it, it's really about unleashing the energy from your journey that makes your work matter, right? So especially in business, we talk all the time about you need to tell better stories. We have these frameworks, you know, the hero's journey, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of it can be paint by numbers, and life is messy and it's complex. And in my mind, when I'm talking storytelling here, Atomic Stories, it's starting with the mess and the chaos of life and uncovering through exercises like the movie theater exercise, uncovering those moments that you've completely forgotten about often. And it can be you yourself, or if you're a company, uncovering them from your customers. Yeah. But that's what you can tap into to build that compelling narrative versus you in your quiet office by yourself trying to come up with the big idea.
Yep. Ooh. The narrative that transformed Logitech. So is this an example of the work in action?
Yeah, so I wanted to give just a few kind of practical examples of how this has played out, both in business and personally.
Okay.
So a couple years ago on my podcast, it's called The Storied Future. The hook of the podcast is leaders who put a new narrative out in the world and then use that narrative to shift the future. And so I had on, at the time, Bracken Darrell, at the time was the CEO of Logitech. And he'd been in all the press, all the business press, won 250 design awards, won the Edison Award that Gates and Jobs won.
Wow. And
remarkable human being. And so you would think there's not a lot of stories that had been told, that hadn't been told, right? And it was interesting. So the place I started in the conversation was, you know, when he was the president of Braun, he gave this speech about this coming design revolution. Yeah. And the 3 phases to get there. And then he went looking for a company that was failing so badly that the only way out was his narrative. So that was Logitech. And I remember he said, you know, I didn't have the guts to tell the board. They brought me on for a 1-year turnaround. I didn't have the guts to tell them, I'm not here for a year. I'm here as long as it takes to make this happen, right? And if I remember correctly, he 4X'd them in 5 years.
Oh, wow.
Which is absolutely remarkable. But that's great. But what I was interested in was what was it like for him internally as he navigated that, right?
Go through that journey.
And his internal narrative. And so it was interesting. So I asked him, what was it like for you as you went through that dip at a human level where you're laying people off, when you're bleeding money? And his initial answer, to be honest, I rolled my eyes internally. His initial answer was, I don't remember the bad times. And so initially I thought, okay, we're not gonna get anywhere. And then it was just this hard shift, and it was a gut punch. Like, I still get chills when I remember it. He said, the reason I don't remember the hard times or the bad times, I think it goes back to when I was 9. My dad left and my mom went off the rails. She, over the course of the next year, had 4 car accidents. She would unload everything on him and his siblings as if they were basically her therapists. Oh. And what was crazy is he said eventually, and I'm imagining this is a number of years later, just because of how mature this is, he said, Mom, I need you to imagine that you're standing on the beach and you have a stick in your hands and you draw a line in the sand behind your heels, and nothing behind that line defines you anymore. The only thing that has power over you is the future. And I was just like, whoa. Like just out of, I mean, and what was crazy is the entire conversation shifted into this really powerful conversation around mental health, about my own journey, and him coaching me. But that was the narrative of the storied future, right? And what I think is important, and a really important takeaway from that is, one, neither one of us planned on that story. I wasn't aware that it was there. I'm guessing he didn't plan on telling it, and I've seen that happen over and over again, is when you create a space, like that's my gift, and my gift to the world is creating a space where people can tell the story that, yes, increases their effectiveness in their business, but also transforms them, right? Hearing their story transforms them. And so what was amazing is after that, their head of comms reached out and they said, that's the best interview we've ever heard on his leadership journey. Are you okay if we make it part of employee onboarding, right?
Wow.
And so I think that's the first, one thing I would love to impress on everyone is that accident and chaos that happens right when we collide with those stories.
Yeah.
So
I love how you broke through like the mold of the executive and then are engaging with the human. I think for a lot of us as professionals, we forget that we're whole human beings when we arrive at work, and we can't really compartmentalize ourselves away from our own selves as we work. So I love that.
yeah, I think it requires, one, a person who's open to that, a leader who's open to that, because a lot of people will clam up and say, I need to have this level of appearance. And I think also a huge part of storytelling, when people say like, hey, how do you get started with this? I encourage people to not start by telling stories, start by listening to stories, right? So sitting with someone and being present and asking questions, like a simple question is like, what gets you out of bed in the morning? What lights you up?
Yeah.
Right? Or asking the opposite, like what tanks you or sucks the life out of you, right? And then watching the person and their energy and how things shift and things like that, right? But yeah, I absolutely love that.
I love that story.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting too, before I get into this story, is also, I started my podcast as brand building and business development, and it has worked for that. But what's interesting is, I tell people honestly, the biggest benefit of a podcast is the people you meet and what you learn and how it transforms you, right? So I had on Whitney Johnson. So she was co-founded a hedge fund with Clayton Christensen, who wrote Disruptive Innovation. One of the top executive coaches in the world. She came on my podcast first season of our first episode of season 2, and she's like, you have something here. Like, I want you to coach me.
Wow.
But you think about what that did for me, right? As I was making a pivot more into that type of work, to have someone do that and unlock that for me was just incredibly powerful, and how that shifts my narrative, right? And again, like the story I'm about to tell is about a transformation of a business. And that's important, but you'll also see kind of how the leader is transformed.
Excellent.
So 2013, I started working at Amazon. And I was telling some friends this story yesterday. I didn't think I would get the job. And it's supposed to be one of the hardest interviews out there. And so I just like, okay, I'll just show up and see what happens.
Yeah.
And I had an interview with this guy named Pete. And I didn't know I was supposed to be afraid of Pete. Like everyone on the floor was terrified of Pete.
Okay.
And he had all the checklists, Chicago MBA, McKinsey consultant, took Amazon Marketplace from 8 employees to 4,000, and eventually I think about 150 billion. And I'm in this interview with him, and he asked me this question that I was not prepared for, which was, Chris, how do you plan to replace yourself with a robot?
Oh, God.
I don't know.
Oh, no.
And so I'm like, I've got to buy time somehow. So I just started pantomiming like a robot. Like, just doing this
doing the
in my
robot in the
interview
chair.
and talking like a robot. I don't know, Pete.
Okay.
And somehow I got the job.
Okay.
And I did well. But fast forward, Pete went on to become a serial CEO and board member. And he came on the podcast in season 1. And it was a great interview, but nothing in my mind that was super remarkable about it. And he went on to become the exec chair of FTD, the flower company. And at the beginning of COVID, we're all sending each other flowers. We're like, this is cute. We're going to be home for 2 weeks,
Yeah.
sending each other flowers, and business is booming, and then they hit a wall. And so in January of last year, the board yanks out the CEO that's in chair and parachutes Pete in with 5 days notice. So the board knew who he was. The executive team knew who he was. None of the employees knew who he was for the most part. Their florists in their network didn't know who he was. And what was interesting is, and then brand new strategy completely, and Pete speaks MBA, right?
Yeah.
So he's like, okay, how am I going to translate this MBA into a way that people understand as we navigate this turbulence, essentially? And so what he ended up doing is, unbeknownst to me, took the podcast and he used it to earn trust. He'd used it to earn trust with the board, because it's like, here's my journey. But then he also used it to earn trust with stakeholders across the business, right? So they would know who he was. And I coached him a bit in the first couple weeks on translating his MBA speak into human. and I'm not taking credit for this. It makes me look good, but he ends up turning them around, leading their most profitable quarter ever, leading a merger, and handing off to a new CEO inside of 6 months.
Wow.
And so I interviewed him afterwards, and the thing he said was, like, yes, all that's great, but the most remarkable thing for me was how hearing my own story transformed me. And what was interesting is I said, and this is recorded, and I'm going to post it eventually, so you can actually see this. I have permission to share this. And Pete's got a pretty thick skin, but I told him, Pete, you're the best business leader I've ever worked for. But everyone in the business was terrified of you. Not because you were mean, you weren't, but you were an automaton. Like, you were that robot, right?
That's why he gave you the job. He saw himself in
saw himself in
the
me.
robot.
Yep, exactly. But I said, what I've seen happen in you over the past 10 years is this transformation to someone who is all about the numbers, and he was highly effective and still is, but also loved people and cares about people. And that transformation, because I used to think change was impossible for adults. But part of why I believe in this work so much is I've seen it work for, yes, my clients, but also for me. Like, I mean, I nearly took my life in 2015 because I had the wrong narrative and had to completely rip and replace it. My marriage ended in 2020. My wife and I are back together, but I had the wrong narrative that took me to that place, and I had to that was fueled by stories, and I had to completely rip and replace that, right? So again, this stuff is super powerful for a company and transforming the company, but it's also start with yourself, right? And yeah, so.
No, it's the recognition that organizations are made of people. Like, again, it's like this weird cultural bias, I think, that's in our society, where we somehow separate the human from the organization, or we think that companies are not organizations made of real human beings. And, that bifurcation, I think, causes a lot of just stress and anxiety and, crisis of identity. So it's amazing when you use stories, what you're really doing is peeling back the persona, and then you're getting to the human being and allowing them to express themselves with dignity and completion. So that's beautiful. That was like a very emotional journey. I wasn't even expecting that this morning, but I feel animated.
Yeah, and I think, because I know you're a data geek,
Yeah.
so this wasn't in the plan. I'll add this one in. This one was also with Pete, but what was interesting is at Amazon Marketplace was the business I worked in. If you looked at the data that was collected, the decision they made was that the entire future of Amazon Marketplace was resellers. So all their investment was spent on recruiting resellers. And that's what you think, because that's what's in the data. What's really interesting, though, is human connection. Someone invited Pete to travel to Brooklyn to meet Amazon sellers on the ground who were second and third generation immigrants who, for example, maybe they came over to the US in the 30s, and started repairing vacuum cleaners.
Yeah.
Well, by the time you get to the third generation, the grandkids are actually selling their own brand of consumables, for example, right? So like vacuum cleaner bags.
Yeah.
So as a result of going and meeting those human beings who weren't accounted for in the data that they couldn't see, he then said, hey, actually brand owners needs to be a focus.
Yeah.
And today, brand owners are over 50% of this business that's in the hundreds of billions, right? And so that idea of, I'm not poo-pooing data,
No,
but it's
you're
both.
taking
It's
an
both.
interest.
Yeah, it's both. It's the human being, and I know that's what's so powerful about the work you do. It's the data to help the human being,
Yeah.
but it's informed by the stories of the human being.
Yeah, there are
along the way.
you just additive, right? Always. Ooh.
Yeah, and I love this quote from Jonathan Adler that the future is never a direct replica of the past, so we need to be able to take the pieces of things that have happened to us and then reconfigure them into possible futures, back to the movie theater, right?
I love that.
So I've been talking a lot, so I want to hear some of your stories and then kind of dig into how this worked and is working for you.
Yeah, I know what this image is referencing. So I got my start, like I said, in the entertainment industry. And I got my start very early. I started college when I was 14 years old, and I got my first job at 17. So I was 17 years old, and I walked into the music department of the Weinstein Company, a famously great place for women to work. And the music department, it was 2010. They just had like a huge round of layoffs. The office in LA was like dark, it was empty, and the music department was like 2 people. And their whole claim to fame was that they had this huge music rights library of like Alexander Desplat and like Akira Kurosawa like scores and all this great stuff, but they hadn't done anything. So all of the contracts demonstrating their rights were in bankers' boxes, like stacked to the ceiling, and their music library was like 25 MP3s on a Macintosh. So I came in at 17, and my boss at the time, Richard Glasser, was born in 1947, said, well, you're really good with technology, right, because you're young. And I'm like, yeah, I guess I am, because I'm young, and what are we doing with all these contracts? So I made myself in charge of our music library. I went through all the contracts. I got the actual recordings that are not lossless files. So MP3s are like very low quality. So I was getting high-res files, and eventually, before I was legal to drink, so from 17 to like 21, I was able to build up this kind of ephemera into an asset. So the music library at that company was earning, I think, $1.2 million in passive royalty income every year, and it was a multi-million-dollar rights deal with BMG. So turned something that was just papers in a box to a multi-million-dollar asset. And I wasn't even legal to drink, so I couldn't even go out and celebrate. So that's that first story.
I love it, and I love what that foreshadows, and I know you'll touch on this more,
Yeah.
but really, I think what other people saw was just some stuff that was in the way versus you seeing the hidden risk and opportunity that was in there.
For sure.
And I know, like you said, when everything went down and everything imploded, you had your own profitable little business over here in the corner.
Yeah, exactly.
So tell me about this email, because I know you had an internal narrative about who you were and where you were headed that needed to be challenged.
This is the real email that I sent, by the way, so read it. But so just like you told yourself that you weren't a salesman, for many years I said I'm not an entrepreneur. I'm not entrepreneurial. So I've been working in entertainment, like within a studio sort of format for over 10 years. I'd done government affairs. I was doing a bunch of grassroots activism on the side. I was doing a million different things, but I was doing it under the auspices of a company. And I said, you know what? I'm not an entrepreneur. I'm just a company man. That's literally how I would describe myself. And then in January of 2020, I went to a Dr. Dre's Grammy party for the producer and engineers, the P&E wing at Grammy.
As one does.
As one does. And I'm like, how old was I? I was 27. I was 26 and I was about to turn 27. And Dre's giving this speech, and I'd worked with him before, so I love hearing him talk about entrepreneurship. He was talking about how you have to just go after your dreams, and you have to do what you want. And I'm like, I'm having a midlife crisis. I'm done with entertainment. I've been doing this for 10 years.
At 26.
I'm like, I'm done. I'm having my midlife crisis. I'm bored. I want to figure out something new to do. And so the week after Grammy weekend, I send this email to my top, like, 2,000 contacts in my Rolodex. Like, I have thousands of people that I know, but I selected the top 2,000 most relevant, and I sent this one email saying, I'm doing Impact and I'm doing whatever now. And I think Chance the Rapper's manager at the time emailed me back. He was like, Godspeed. And that was it. Like, I started my company in January of 2020, which was excellent.
Hold on just one second, because there's marketers in the room, and they need to know what your response rate was on this email.
It was 87%. My response rate was 87%. And actually, you know, it's 2024 now. That's the only marketing I've ever done for Zorin, my consultancy. That one email, all of the business I've gotten has all been word of mouth, people who knew me, people who reached out to me. And in 2020, you know, the pandemic happened like months after I sent this email. So my timing was excellent. I'm like, oh God, I left my salaried job and now I'm an entrepreneur and there's a global pandemic. But what happened in 2020 was people just started coming to me. They were like, you know, after the murder of George Floyd, you know, record labels and, you know, film festivals were like, you know, Sienna, how do we as the creative industry respond to this present moment? Like, what is our fiduciary duty to society? And I'm like, you know, I'm happy to have that conversation, but you have to pay me for it. And I've just been working on word of mouth referral ever since. And that actually, so that is some artwork from the first big campaign I did when I launched my own company was in 2020, and it was for the presidential election. So I worked with a super PAC, I worked with another creative director, and we created this huge Get Out the Vote campaign that was specifically targeting Black voters. We commissioned artists. So this is the artwork of V. Casanova, really brilliant artist based in Los Angeles. So she did like a portrait of Kamala Harris, which you see on the right, artwork of Nina Simone. We worked with the same guy who did Beyonce's cover for Complex, because I had him in my, you know, again, in that Rolodex, right? And also executive produced some live events for BET and, you know, worked with the rapper Common. And ultimately the campaign successfully registered 114,000 African Americans for the 2020 election, which ended up being quite consequential, right? Especially in swing states where we were really channeling a lot of our work. So this was my first big project, and it was the confirmation that actually I am an entrepreneur and I can pull off like huge things like ex nihilo from nothing if I just like have my collaborators and have a tribe around me and people that I can reach out to and be like, hey, I'm working on this. Like, you want in? And to my surprise, people, yeah, they wanted in. So that was a game changer. That was a real eye opener for me.
Well, I think one thing that you're better at than pretty much anyone I've ever met is that belief in community.
Yes.
And helping other people create stories, but also write and rewrite their narratives, right? That's something you do for me all the time.
Thank you.
And I think, like, it was a great email,
yeah.
right? But it wasn't the email that did it, right? It was you and the people that you had created narratives with along the way that did that, right?
I'm really lucky. I'm really lucky in that sense. I think it's because I've always treated my relationships like friendships. And my father, who's, you know, a director in television, right? He has this thing that he says, his narrative of the art of collaboration, the idea that we're all equal and that we work together as collaborators to do amazing things. So he's a storyteller and a creative, and I think that's where a lot of my own little atomic stories are actually, like, can you inherit a story? I feel like I have in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. Well, I think that takes us to, as we're kind of on the home stretch here, kind of the way that I think about kind of creating, how do we create a narrative flywheel, right? So the narrative, the future narrative, or the narrative that we're trying to create is anchored in the future, so which I call future gravity, right? Because we all have narratives, and our company has narratives, and individuals in the company have narratives, and those either propel us or hold us back, right? So the future gravity is like, okay, what's that thing in the future that overcomes that status quo, right? And the stories then filter in, and then we synthesize those with, in the business context, with our data, with our strategy, with our processes, our culture, all of that. And then we make choices, which is Roger Martin's where to play, how to win, which is strategy essentially of, okay, how do we then align and use these stories to build a narrative that gets us to the future? And then there's wins and losses, which are essentially learnings that happen as a result of that. And then stories flow out of that, and it keeps going. So I'm curious for you, you know, you talked about the impact work that you do, but I'm curious with your startup, one, what are you doing? And two, what does that future look like that you're creating that's propelling your company, but also everyone that's joining in with you?
Yeah, so in short, I'm currently building, like I said, two-time founder. My second company is a B2B SaaS that is focused on HR compliance automation and risk mitigation, so very exciting. But the reason why is because so much of the impact work I do as a consultant is focused on fixing cultures, making organizations better, and making them better in a way that's, you know, it's profitable as well, and it's good for human beings. And I was like, how do I turn that into something scalable? How do I productize that? And that's what Norterra is about. It's about making organizations fairer, more just, more equitable, and more successful as a result, and kind of demonstrating finally to skeptics that when you build an inclusive, strong organization that treats people well, that addresses the whole human, like we've been talking about this whole hour, you're gonna have a more successful organization. You're gonna drive profit, you're gonna drive innovation, you're gonna maximize the potential of what can be achieved because you're maximizing the potential of the human beings that are working with you.
Well, I think what you're doing too is you're bringing an accountability and a level of, you're kind of pushing people to be honest, right? Because the narrative, we can say on the surface, hey, we're doing these good things as a company, but you're actually giving people a reason to care and change because it's hitting their bottom line.
Exactly. Like a lot of companies will make claims with kind of static data that doesn't have a story behind it. Like they'll say, oh, you know, we're at gender parity, like half of our employees are women. But then when you actually dig deep and kind of go through those layers of data that we're going to be looking at with our software, you actually find, hey, yeah, it's 50% technically, but all of your female employees are in like sales and you only have 2 women engineers. Or, oh, hey, you do have a lot of African Americans in your employ, but the majority of them are entry level. They're not getting promotions, they're not getting mentorship, and they're actually cycling out 5 times faster than your white employees. Why is that? So you can always, you know, data can give you just like a snapshot, but unless you have the context of that human experience and those stories, then you're missing the bigger picture and you're missing the context that really makes that data useful for decision makers.
So if you could take the young Sienna with the banker's boxes and then project yourself into the future, what would that experience have looked like for you after this world is created?
I mean, if we're able to achieve the things that we want to with this technology, like I think back to like that young 17-year-old, like she wasn't getting paid what she deserved. Like she was creating all this value for the company, but she wasn't getting promotions at the same rate that her white peer was getting, who had been there half as long, and she wasn't getting paid. And she didn't realize it because there was just like no infrastructure to support her journey. So I think about like how much further I could be, or I could have gotten in my career in entertainment, even though it was really successful. There are things that were slipped through the cracks that could have been caught. So I think about that, and what it does is it motivates me to create a condition where that doesn't happen to anyone, where every person, when they show up to work, they get treated with dignity, respect, fairness, and equality of opportunity, right? Because if you have equality of opportunity, people can really fly. And I want that for other people. Like, I don't want anyone to have experienced the things that I experienced in the workplace. And that's how all of my co-founders and all my team members feel as well. We have a shared commitment to making things better, because, you know, when everyone succeeds and, you know, people who are underrepresented and undersupported succeed, we all succeed. And that's kind of like our animating belief in everything we do, from like the executive level down to our engineering team.
So I'm curious, like making the leap from the regular paycheck to entrepreneurship is scary for anyone.
Yeah.
Do you see a connection between your work not being valued and not being compensated the way you should have been, and your internal narrative before you made the leap?
You know what? That might have played into my fear around entrepreneurship, right? Or like what would I do without a supporting infrastructure? Because one of the things about entrepreneurship they don't really tell you is like, it's not just the business that you're building or the work that you're doing for your clients. It's you are also your own HR. You're also your own CTO. You're also your own CMO. You're building the plane as you fly it, and then the plane has to fly on a mission, right? So you've got these multiple things that you have to consider. Now that I've been doing it for a couple years, I could never go back.
Yeah.
Like I love it so much. The challenges that are represented are rewarding to me. I've learned so much. I've grown so much as a person. Like I think about the person I am now, so much braver and more confident than the person that I was then, even though I feel really good about the person I was then. But I feel like I've grown in ways I never could have predicted.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I love it.
Thank
Love
you.
it.
Oh, this is actually the slide that I'm excited by the most. So we've talked a lot about stories. You've shared amazing ones. I feel like I've shared pretty cool ones as well. But as of right now, what's the best story that you personally have ever heard?
So I'll switch it up a little bit. What I like to talk about is the best story I've ever felt. So as I mentioned before, 2015, I nearly took my life. And when I came back to work from disability, I had a manager the kindest manager I've ever had. And he had Pearl Jam tattoos all over his arm, which by the way, yesterday was Pearl Jam Day.
Yeah.
And this guy actually posted yesterday before this talk about this. And I couldn't stand Pearl Jam, and I live in Seattle. And back when they first came out, I was like, I've got to like them, they're cool, and I just couldn't get into it, right? And so I asked him, why do you have tell me about Pearl Jam and why you're into them. And he said, well, when I was in college in the 90s, I was driving back to college, and I heard from my mom that my dad had died. So I turned the car around, drove back across Michigan with tears streaming down my face, and Pearl Jam had just come out, and he's listening to their album. And the song Alive just completely tore him up and was also a source of healing for him over time, right? And has been over the years. So because of that story he told him, like, okay, I'll give Pearl Jam another shot, right? And I remember because of his story, that song became an anthem to me, and it became healing for me, this music that I couldn't stand before.
Yeah.
I remember driving down the road singing it at the top of my lungs, right? So that was 2015-ish. Fast forward to last fall, and I see this video of Eddie Vedder, the lead singer of Pearl Jam, and he's talking about that song, and he said, actually, that song doesn't mean what any of our fans think it means. My dad left when I was like 14 and told me he wasn't my dad, and so it was really an FU song to his dad, where all the fans thought it meant like, hey, I'm free and I'm experiencing life now. But he said, once I heard what the fans believed it meant over the years, it totally transformed the meaning. It completely changed the meaning in my mind, and I now believe what they believe, and it broke the curse for me.
That's beautiful.
So like, talk about a narrative shift, right? So that's a crazy story on its own, but it's about to get a lot crazier.
Oh my God.
Fast forward 2 weeks from when I posted about that on LinkedIn. Take my daughter and her best friend to the record store in West Seattle. And we're in there, and I said, okay, here's the deal. Everyone gets $10 and see who can get the best haul, which means you got to buy used, right? So we go in there, we're all digging, we get nothing. We all come up dry. So we're like, okay, let's just go to the bakery. We're walking across the crosswalk, and I said, wait a second. There's an album I wanted to look at. I'll be right back. Walk back in the store, walk back upstairs, and Eddie Vedder is standing right there digging for vinyl. I was like, okay, I want to say something to him, tell him my story, but I'm like, yeah, he doesn't want to be bothered. And then I'm like, nah, it's probably not him. And then I hear him talking, and I'm like, yeah, it's him. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this. So I go up and I tell him, or I just thank him for his music or whatever, and then start to walk away. I just try to play it cool. And I'm like, no, you need to tell him the story. So I told him this story, but the first thing I said, probably not a good lead-in, was, I never liked your music. But then I told him that story. And it was crazy. He just gave me the biggest hug, and it was like electricity. And sure, he's famous and whatever, and that's cool. But it was this full circle connection point of the pain that he went through as a kid, the song that he created, the fans hearing it, the fans rewriting his narrative, him impacting my manager impacting me, and then me telling it back to him. And I mean,
That's beautiful.
it doesn't get much better than that. So
That is an atomic story.
absolutely, absolutely.
Oh my God.
But yeah, that's the end of our time.
Oh yeah. Oh no. I was really enjoying this conversation.
I know, we could have kept going. Maybe we need to do like a LinkedIn Live or
We
something.
need to do a LinkedIn Live, but also we're going to be around all day. So folks, like, please connect with us on LinkedIn. I love to talk to people and I love to meet new folks. So thank you all so much for your time today. We really appreciate you coming out to hear us talk.